Welcome everyone to another episode of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Casino Kid 2, brought to us by Sofel. Casino Kid 2, obviously the sequel to the original Casino Kid, condenses things a little bit. There's only 9 opponents for you to face throughout the game. There's 3 in Blackjack, 3 in Poker, and now 3 in Roulette, as Roulette is added to the mix. In Casino Kid 2 though, since you've already conquered Las Vegas, your goal is to travel around the world to meet your opponents and face them in their particular game. When we start the game, we get our opening cutscene before diving in. After the opening cutscene, we now get to choose where we would like to go. We can move our coin around and show off all the different places in the world we can travel to. Each of the opponents has a different difficulty rating. As you can see, they'll have like the name of the game they play, and then the symbols below represent how difficult they are. And the first opponent we're going to be facing off is the very Chung-Li looking Sri Lanka from China, and we're going to be playing her in Roulette. Now, Roulette is new, and there's a lot of rules to Roulette. However, in the game, as far as strategy goes, it's extremely easy. Unlike the first game, where the phrases that the characters give before you place your bet really doesn't affect too much, in this game, it extremely affects it. For example, she said, "I may hit 00 or I may not." We're going to place a bet now on either 27, 00, or 1. It's guaranteed it will land on one of those 3 numbers. There is a fantastic guide available on Game FAQs for you to be able to know all the phrases and all the possible outcomes, making Roulette a breeze. There's a ton of possible bets and thus possible outcomes for Roulette. You can bet on any individual number, you can bet on 0, 00, the first 12 numbers, the second 12 numbers, the third 12 numbers, evens, odds, 1 through 18, red or black. There's tons of possibilities. If you bet the individual number itself and that comes up, you're going to win a bigger reward. However, of course, the more numbers involved in your bet, the less reward you're going to get. After defeating a character, we move back to the map and move on to the next one, as we're now traveling to England to take on Paul Keaton, the second Roulette player. I usually like to take out all 3 of the Roulette players right away. The tougher opponent means that there's a lot more possible numbers and outcomes for this. For example, he said, "I don't like black cars." This means any black number could possibly come up, so the safe bet is going to be to place on black, and place as much money as you possibly can on black. It's guaranteed that a black number will come up. If you know the phrases and what numbers there can possibly be as an outcome, Roulette ends up being the easiest of the 3 games included in Casino Kid 2. We place a huge bet, we get 15, which of course is a black number, and we get a decent amount of money. However, that is one of the broadest bets, so because of that we only get a 1-for-1 payout, so we still have to go another one. Now his next thing he says is betting on one number is risky, and that means it's going to be either 25, 27, 29, 31, 33, or 35. That's a pretty large amount. Usually I just stick with 25, bet on that, and if I win, I win. Since it's so early on in the game, I'm not really risking too much if I had to reset for placing all my money on one particular number. Of course, here we go, we end up getting the number 25 on this run, and thus I get a large payout. Now, of course, you may not want to bet that much if you're just trying to play through the game in one go without resetting or anything like that. You may want to try to spread your bets out a little bit more or wait for a better odds in your favor to drain the rest of the money. Just like with Casino Kid 1, I'm not an exact expert in casino games. If I was, I'd probably have a lot more money. So because of that, I'm just going to do my best to kind of explain how really the game works more so than the actual individual games themselves. Now, instead of going right to the third roulette player, which is usually what I like to do, we're gonna actually go and play the first of the poker opponents. Now, poker and blackjack play very similar to the way they did in Casino Kid 1, however, thankfully, blackjack doesn't drag nearly as bad as it did in that game. Now, for poker strategies, of course, if you have a pair of cards that you're dealt, you're going to keep that pair. I also like to bet max pretty much every time. Now, if you bet max, you may scare off your opponent, and they may just flat out fold on you. However, usually, more times than not, they're not going to fold, and they're going to match your bet no matter what they end up having in their hand. Of course, if we don't have a matching pair already defaultly dealt to us, we're going to go either with the high cards, like any face cards, ace, king, queen, jack, or we may take a couple of the same suit, depending upon how many of the same suit we already have, and try to go for a flush. Just like with Casino Kid 1, I usually find myself winning with just a single pair. A high pair of kings or queens will win most of the time, it seems like. Though I have seen the opponent get some really ridiculous hands, especially the harder difficulty ones. Now, the opponents also do say things just like the roulette players, and these give you little hints. For example, he just went on this one. This one pretty much means there's nothing for us to really worry about, and we're going to probably win the hand. Now, however, on our next hand, he's going to say ow. This means he does actually have an awful hand, and as long as we have pretty much a pair, we're going to win this next hand. Just like I said during roulette, there is a great guide to help you know every single phrase and pretty much give you the really high advantage of being able to take out the individual opponents in the game. Also, like Casino Kid 1, I'm not going to show every single hand that we dealt with in the game, because once you got the gist of everything and kind of learn the phrases, you should have no problem being able to dwindle down your opponent's cash. Now, after this hand, I'm able to drain him down just to near the end, but I'm dealt an actual straight, which doesn't happen very often, but in this case, I'm going to, of course, keep every one of the cards as I have a straight, and it's pretty much guaranteed I'm going to win this hand no matter what he really has. And I'm lucky enough that he said ow, which means I have him. Now, moving on from all-time silver, we're going to go over all the way to Australia and take on the first blackjack opponent. Basically, our first opponent is basically a tutorial. She ends up busting a lot and going over 21, so it's very easy, and you can be very conservative with her. If you end up facing off with her after just a few other opponents, you're going to have way, way more money than she does, so it won't be that big of a problem to get rid of her. Also, the cards are dealt seemingly, and the menus go a bit faster in Blackjack and Casino Kid 2 than they did in 1. At least, it feels that way, though I'm not exactly sure if it is true or not. If you're very confident and have something like 11 or 12, you may want to do a double down where you bet double on your next card, thus taking double from your opponent if you end up winning. Of course, if you have a 17 or higher, you're going to more than likely want to just stand on it and keep it. Even if you end up losing, there was really no point in hitting, because more likely than not, you're going to end up going over. If you have two of the same cards, you may want to go ahead and do the split. This means you're basically playing with two hands, and if you're able to win with both hands, you're going to end up winning double. Also with Blackjack, this is the game where I've just consistently stood at what I end up getting dealt, and I've had successes, a lot of times winning flat out against some of the opponents in the game by just mashing the A button over and over. Now, for the first time in the game, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to when we finally drain the rest of the money from her. After she has finally been defeated, we can move on to our next opponent. You're going to be spending most of your time if you're just playing straight through on the blackjack opponents once you get the hang of poker and roulette. Now we're just going to go right next to Australia, to the left here, and go to India. And like I said, you can do the opponents in any order as long as you have the money to bet against the opponents, because you cumulative build up your money. Now, because we have a good amount built up, we're going to go ahead and do the last of the roulette games. Now, just like our other opponents, the key to winning is listening to what they say, or reading what they say. And he says, I am always the winner. This means he's going to have any odd or red number. So, place your thing on red and odd, or just one or the other, and you're guaranteed to win. Unfortunately, that doesn't give us a lot of money, but it will start draining his money. Now, him saying that again means, well, once again, that means any odd or red numbers. So you can place this same exact bet, or you can just place it all on one color or on odds if you want to. But being able to place all of that money on red that quickly, even with just 2 spins of the wheel, I'm able to take all of his money and move on to my next opponent. Now, next up, we're going to travel all the way over to Canada and take on Rocky Hammer, easily one of the best names in the game. But unfortunately, he's the second of the blackjack players. For our second blackjack opponent, of course he's going to have more money, he's going to be a little bit more tough, he's going to get better hands seemingly more often than the first opponent, but your strategy and how you're going to play against him is pretty much going to be the exact same. One thing I didn't mention in Casino Kid 1 that you can do, and that you absolutely can do in Casino Kid 2, is actually go all in on a hand. You can do it in poker and blackjack. The only thing is, your opponent has to accept it, and it seems more often than not, if you go right in and like, I want to bet everything on the very first hand, they're not going to take it. However, a little bit into the matchup against an opponent, you can try to go all in, and if they accept it and you win, of course, you can definitely speed up the game a bit. After a pretty lengthy match with Rocky, I'm able to drain the rest of his money, and we're going to move on to our next opponent. Now, instead of going and taking out the third blackjack opponent, I'm instead going to go down to Africa and deal with our second poker opponent from Nigeria. Now, as far as reading what he is saying and how they interpret that, he says the same things, and it works the same way as Alton Silver did back in Brazil. So you can kind of get an idea of how his hand's going by what he says. Now, also, he will get better hands, though, than our first poker opponent. So keep that in mind. You may not want to bet quite as heavy if you want to be more conservative, just because there's more likely a chance for him to get better hands. So usually my strategy is pretty much bet max on every hand no matter what, and just hope for the best, keeping any single pairs I can end up getting, or just keeping my high cards. Thankfully, the game does a great job of being able to bet highly enough that it doesn't drag like it did in the original Casino Kid, taking sometimes forever to get through some of the later matches because you weren't able to bet high enough. Now, like I said, you can bet all in, but a lot of times the opponent will just say no to you. When it comes to what he's saying, if he says I'm fine or anything other than pretty much laughing at you, then you're gonna be okay. I'm fine means he at least has a pair, but he doesn't have like an amazing hand. But if he laughs at you, that means he pretty much has either like a flush or a straight or even a full house. So you may want to back off, bet less, or just completely fold on the hand and move on to the next one. Move ahead just a tiny bit on this last one. I ended up getting dealt 2 pair in the same hand, and I easily defeat Othman, and we can move on to our next opponent. Now we only have 2 more opponents left, the 3rd difficulty blackjack player and the 3rd difficulty poker player, so I'm going to go to the blackjack player first. Now this guy doesn't play around like the other 2 blackjack opponents. He gets really good hands a lot of the time, and it can be really difficult in order to try to beat him sometimes. Of course, if you get anything that's like a 14 or less, I usually do the double down on it, bet double, and hope that I don't end up busting on that. As you can see, even on the very beginning here, I was able to get that and at least win double on that first hand, slowly bringing down his money. Now the good news is he only has 10,000 to start, and you can bet 1,000 per hand, so once again, the game does a good job of speeding things along. Interesting to note that Casino Kid 2 was actually not released in Japan. It was released late in the NES life cycle here in North America, but didn't even see a Japanese release, unlike the original Casino Kid that was released in both North America and Japan, with the North America and Japanese versions being vastly different from one another. Another thing cool about the game is the soundtrack for it, which is pretty good. All the Sofel music was really well done. It was composed by Kenji Eno and Mashiya Hirasawa, who would go on later to form Warp Games and do the D, Enemy Zero, and D2 games. Like I said, it can be really difficult to try to dwindle down the money of the final blackjack opponent. He always seems to have face cards facing up right away, so it can be very intimidating a lot of times. Any point that I see that he's starting with a 2, I'm going to go ahead and do a double down here. I got lucky that he ends up doing way too many cards and busting, but I've had it plenty of times also where he somehow starts with that 2 facing up and then goes right into a blackjack. At the end of the matchup, I do a pretty risky double down. I already had a pretty high amount, but I did it anyway. I ended up getting a blackjack out of it in order to finally defeat him and move on now to our final opponent before the final boss of the game, traveling to Japan to take on the 3rd poker player. Now for the final poker player, he always ends up getting good hands. It's almost consistency that he's going to have at least a pair. You're not going to defeat him many times with a high card, so if that's all you have going in, more often than not, you're going to end up losing that hand. Now, he does give a few cues that can help you out, but it's really not much. Basically, he'll do like an owl or no way, man. But they're very rare for you to actually see, so it can be difficult to know exactly what he's doing. Now, if he does that, use that to your advantage, because that means, of course, he doesn't have anything really to offer. Now, also, another thing, if you gradually bet and let him raise the pot, if he bets 500, usually that means he has a really good hand. If he only goes 300, that means he has a lesser hand. But he'll usually also always take your raising, so if you want to bet max on every one of your hands, you can pretty much do that and he will match you 9 times out of 10. Like I've been doing throughout, if you start with a pair, of course, save that, save any face cards, or if you have the possibility of something like a straight forming, you may want to go ahead and risk and try to keep all the cards that you're going for that straight, or even a flush. Remember, you can also try to go all in on hands, but of course he's going to have to accept it. He doesn't do that that often. It's usually just allowing you to raise the pot all the way up that he'll usually go with. After a very lengthy fight, we can now move on to the final opponent, King, from Las Vegas itself, the final opponent. Now this works that you actually have to face off with him in all 3 games, roulette, blackjack, and poker. This can be, of course, difficult beating him in all 3 in a row. The good thing is you start off with roulette, and it's just as easy to manipulate as before. Since you said, well, what should I do? That means it's going to be something in the first column. Usually, this ends up being either 19, 25, 28, or 34, though I usually like to throw my bets all around between 19 and 25. And as long as it's one of those numbers within that little span of numbers in that first column, I usually end up coming out with some money. Now, we don't even need to have that great of a second hand here in order to drain the rest of his money, since we had such a good first time going. Now, he says, there's nothing you can do, kid. This means it's going to be in the first 12. So you can just bet 1 through 12 and easily win. 1, 4, and 12 come up a lot, but it's safe to just go 1 through 12. Just put all the money you can on that, because you're going to win. With that 2 for 1, he ends up giving us quite a bit of money that drains the rest of what he has, and now we move on to the blackjack portion. Now, when it comes to the blackjack, he has 100,000. You can bet 10,000 per hand, so it's not too bad to start draining it down as long as you can get on a nice little win streak. Thing is, of course, he's even tougher than the previous blackjack opponent, so a lot of times he's going to have very high amounts. He's going to be close 18, 19, 20, 21. He very rarely will bust. I keep my same strats as I've always had. If it's usually 14 through 10, I do a double. Of course, splitting when possible, and you don't want to hit usually if it's 18, if you already have 18, 19, or 20. Pretty much common sense stuff. It takes quite a bit, but finally, after a very lucky bust from him, I'm able to complete the blackjack portion and move on to the poker set. Now, the poker round actually isn't too bad in order to actually complete. Now, your opponent's not going to say too much. He still says the same things that all the other poker opponents say. However, if you see him go just ... or he says alright, that is a bluff. If he says alright, usually that's a bluff. He doesn't really have a good hand. If he just goes ... usually means he has a pretty terrible hand. You also seem to have better luck during the course of this matchup. I always end up getting high pairs or, 2 or even full houses. Now, example here, I actually have a 4, 5, 6, and a 7 already. Now, you can of course go for the straight. I usually just go for the safe bet. I just keep the ace of all things and hope they get something better. I end up getting dealt just a pair of 8s in return, but I'm just going to keep raising against him, and hopefully I end up getting him to fold, which he actually would have beaten me. So that's a very rare chance that he actually folded when I actually had a worse hand than he did. It won't take too long for you to be able to get him down to the lower amount of money. I want to show this hand in particular because I get dealt a full house right away, which is something that very, very rarely ends up happening. But what ends up being cool about this hand is he also ended up getting a full house dealt to him, just mine ended up being higher. He had 6 and 5s, I had jacks and 4s, and because of the jacks, of course, I end up beating him. Now, you can also, when you get him down to the low amount of money, as long as you bet more than what he has, that's it. You can then sit back and enjoy the ending to Casino Kid 2. So there we have Casino Kid 2 for the NES. While I think Casino Kid 1 offers more, there's more opponents to play and all, the feel and the speed of Casino Kid 2, I think, lends itself to be more able to be picked up and played and be completed in a single go. Overall, though, I love both games, and there's actually a surprising amount of casino-based games on the NES. Casino Kid 1, though, is just my personal favorite as I grew up with it. But with that, though, we see the end at the end of the game, and that will wrap up this episode of Play It Through. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a thumbs up or commenting down below. Those things actually do help the video get seen by more people. Now if you enjoyed the Play It Through for Casino Kid 2, you're probably going to enjoy the Play It Through for Casino Kid 1. You can check that out by clicking the footage right over there. I also want to give a huge special thank you to all the members of my Patreon. In fact, Casino Kid 1 and 2's Play It Through were Patreon incentive donated for, thanks to Zero Eats. Now if you'd like to check out my Patreon, you can do so by clicking the big button down below. As little as $1 a month can keep this channel going. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.